At one point in history, Charles Ponzi was the name on everyone's lips. Known for running one of the most profitable investment schemes in America, he had millions of dollars at his disposal and a steady stream of eager investors lining up to hand over their savings. People believed they were making smart decisions, trusting Ponzi with their money, convinced that they were about to reap huge rewards. He had a reputation of success, and it seemed like nothing could go wrong. But behind the curtains of his so-called business, everything was built on a lie. Ponzi's empire was nothing more than an elaborate scam, designed to funnel money from new investors to pay off older ones. While Ponzi grew richer by the day, many innocent people were left with nothing. Their hard-earned money vanished, and their faith in the system was shattered. This story serves as a reminder to always stay cautious with your investments. Make sure to subscribe to our channel as we dive deeper into fascinating stories like this one, so you won't miss out on more insightful and eye-opening tales. Charles Ponzi was born on March 3, 1882, in a quaint town in Italy, far from the bustling cities that were home to the wealth and success his family had once known. His father was a steady postman, and though they weren't poor, the family's lifestyle was a far cry from the grandeur Ponzi's ancestors had enjoyed. His grandparents and great-grandparents were once respected figures in their community, successful merchants, influential businessmen, and even public officials. The family name carried weight, and they lived lives of comfort and prosperity. But as time went on, the family's fortunes began to fade. By the time Charles was born, the high status they once held had slipped through their fingers. His father worked hard, but the old wealth and influence seemed like a distant memory. For young Ponzi, this fall from grace left a bitter taste. He couldn't quite grasp why his family, once at the top, now struggled to make ends meet. The contrast between the life he was living and the stories he'd heard about his family's past haunted him. Ponzi became fixated on the idea that his family deserved more, much more. The loss of their former glory left him feeling resentful and frustrated. He wanted to restore the family name and reclaim the life that had slipped away. His early years were marked by a deep sense of dissatisfaction, and he began to resent the ordinary, modest life that had been handed to him. This desire for more pushed Ponzi to dream bigger and reach higher. He wasn't content to live a quiet life. He wanted to build something monumental, something that would bring back the wealth and status his family had once enjoyed. And soon, this relentless ambition would lead him down a path that would forever change the course of his life and the lives of thousands of others. In 1903, Charles Ponzi stepped off the SS Vancouver and onto the busy docks of Boston, his heart racing with a mixture of hope and uncertainty. He had come to America seeking a fresh start, but the reality of his situation quickly hit him as the vast city stretched out before him. The streets were filled with people from all walks of life, each with their own goals and dreams. And yet, here he was, just another immigrant with nothing but his ambition and a handful of coins in his pocket. As Ponzi made his way through the unfamiliar city, he couldn't help but feel the weight of his mother's expectations on his shoulders. Back in Italy, she had sent him off with high hopes, believing that America was the land of opportunity where he would make his fortune. He had promised her he would return home a wealthy man, someone who could lift the family out of the struggles they had faced for so long. But now, standing in a foreign country with no money and no real plan, those promises felt like distant memories. Ponzi had hoped to find a quick way to secure his future, but America wasn't the land of instant riches he had imagined. It wasn't filled with the kind of easy success he had been led to believe in. There were no waiting inheritances, no wealthy relatives ready to open doors for him. He was alone, and the harsh truth was that nobody in this vast new country cared who he was or where he came from. For the first time, Ponzi was faced with the reality that success wasn't handed to you. It had to be earned, and it was going to be a long, hard road. But even as he stood there, feeling lost, Ponzi refused to give up. He was determined to find a way to redeem himself, to turn things around and make his way back home to Italy, not as a failure, but as a success. The pressure of his family's expectations fueled him, but it also made him desperate. He began to search for opportunities everywhere, throwing himself into various jobs, from working in a factory to doing odd jobs for local businesses. Yet nothing seemed to stick. Each attempt was met with disappointment, and he found himself drifting from one short-term job to another, struggling to make ends meet. Still, Ponzi couldn't shake the belief that there was a way out. a way to achieve the wealth and success he had always dreamed of. It wasn't long before he stumbled across the idea that would change his life forever. As he watched others around him pursuing their own ventures, he began to realize that the key to success in this new world wasn't just about hard work. It was about finding the right opportunity and knowing how to exploit it. Ponzi quickly became obsessed with the idea of making money, but not just through ordinary means. He started researching different investment schemes, learning about how money flowed through the system and how people made fortunes. The idea of being able to collect money from others, using their investments to pay off earlier investors, caught his attention. It was a simple concept, but Ponzi saw the potential in it. He could use the money from new investors to pay back the promises he had made to others, all while pocketing a portion of the profits for himself. It was risky, yes, but it was also a way to make the kind of money he had been dreaming about. His desperation pushed him to take that first step, to build the foundation for what would later become his infamous scheme. He began to gather a few people who were willing to listen to his pitch, promising them high returns on their investments. It didn't take long before word began to spread. Ponzi's charm, his ability to sell a dream, began to work in his favor. People lined up, eager to invest in his business, believing that they were making a smart move for their future. Ponzi could hardly believe it. For the first time since arriving in America, he felt in control, like he had found his way out of the mess he had created. However, as Ponzi's scheme began to grow, so did the pressure to keep it running. The money he was collecting from new investors was enough to pay off the early ones, but Ponzi knew that at some point, the whole thing could come crashing down if he didn't find new sources of funds. But for the moment, it didn't matter. Ponzi was living the dream. He had money, he had power, and people looked up to him. His rise was swift, and so was his belief that he had finally found the answer to all of his problems. Still, in the back of his mind, Ponzi knew that this wasn't a long-term solution. But at that moment, he pushed aside the doubts, focusing only on the rewards that were just within his grasp. He had started with nothing, and now, with the help of his charm and cleverness, he was on the verge of becoming one of the most well-known figures in America. However, the price for success would be much higher than he could have ever imagined. The dream was alive, but the nightmare was lurking just around the corner. Ponzi had spent 2 long years behind bars, the kind of time that feels like a lifetime when you're trapped inside. He had been locked away for his crimes, but when the day finally came for him to walk free, it was like the weight of the world had been lifted off his shoulders. The air outside felt fresh, even though his heart was still heavy with the mistakes of the past. But in that moment, something stirred inside him, a kind of hunger. A hunger to start over, to make things right, and, most importantly, to prove to himself and everyone around him that he could succeed. The first thing on his mind when he stepped out into the daylight was to return to the United States. It was a place he had once dreamed of, a land of opportunity where anything seemed possible. It wasn't just about escaping his past anymore. It was about going back to where things had once looked so promising. But this time, things were going to be different. He wasn't going to just pack a suitcase and board a ship like a regular passenger. He had bigger plans. He wasn't going alone. Ponzi had a new idea, a dangerous one. He wasn't just going to travel as a free man. He was going to bring a few others with him, too. And not just any passengers. He had made a deal with a group of fresh-faced Italian immigrants, men and women who had just arrived in the country. They were desperate to start a new life, to escape the poverty and struggles they had known back home in Italy. But the catch was they didn't have proper papers. They didn't have the legal right to be in the United States. And Ponzi had been paid handsomely to help them get across the border, to sneak them into the land they had dreamed of. It wasn't exactly a clean deal. It wasn't legal, and Ponzi knew that. But for him, the end justified the means. The money was good, and more than that, it felt like a step toward something bigger. He wasn't just getting back to America. He was building something. Even if it was built on shaky ground, even if it was a risk, Ponzi was willing to take it. He wasn't afraid of breaking a few rules if it meant he could make his mark on the world. So he set the plan into motion. He met with the immigrants, men and women, all with the same dream of a better life, and all ready to take the risk. They were nervous, unsure, but they trusted Ponzi. After all, he had been in America before. He had made promises that had seemed impossible, but they had trusted him once. Maybe, just maybe, this time he could do it again. They needed a way in, and Ponzi was their way in. The journey was long, and the risks were high. They traveled in secrecy, staying out of sight as much as possible. Ponzi guided them through hidden routes, using every trick he knew to keep them off the radar of the authorities. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when it all felt like it was going to fall apart. The immigrants, who had once been full of hope, were now beginning to feel the weight of the uncertainty. Some of them started to doubt. Was it worth it? Were they really going to make it? They had left everything behind. Families, homes, their old lives, and now they were risking it all on a man they barely knew. But Ponzi remained calm. He reassured them, promised them they were almost there. He told them that they were on the brink of something huge, that they just needed to keep going, and everything would fall into place. And in those moments, Ponzi felt a sense of power. It was like the world was in his hands, and he could make it bend to his will. He was the one with the answers. He was the one who could lead them to the new life they had dreamed of. When they finally arrived, it wasn't the grand, life-changing moment Ponzi had hoped for. The authorities were waiting. The group was caught. Ponzi's plans, his careful manipulation, had fallen apart in an instant. Everything he had worked for had come crashing down. The immigrants were sent back, and Ponzi was once again facing the consequences of his actions. It was a hard blow, a brutal reminder that, no matter how carefully you plan or how many people you convince, sometimes things just don't work out. But even then, even with everything crashing down around him, Ponzi refused to give up. He wasn't done yet. He had been knocked down, but he wasn't out. He knew that the game wasn't over. And more than anything, Ponzi knew that the real prize wasn't just about smuggling people into the United States or getting rich quick. It was about finding a way to make it big, no matter the cost. Ponzi had learned something in those moments of failure. He had learned that there was always another way, always another door to open. He might have failed with the immigrants, but he knew he could try something else. And next time it would work. He would make sure of it. And so he began again. He started small, working with people who had money, people who trusted him, people who believed in his promises. He began to build a new kind of empire, one where the rules didn't apply, where he could call the shots. Ponzi had always believed in the American dream, but now he saw it differently. He realized that the dream wasn't about hard work and honesty. It was about knowing how to play the game, about making people believe in something that wasn't real. And Ponzi was getting better at that with every move he made. For those who are following along with Ponzi's story, remember that this is just the beginning. If you've enjoyed these tales and want to hear more about his journey, the twists and turns that led him down an even darker path, make sure to hit the subscribe button. Stay with us as we dive deeper into the story of Charles Ponzi, a man who would stop at nothing to chase his dreams and break the rules along the way. You won't want to miss what happens next. Years before his release from prison, Charles Ponzi had come across something that would forever change the course of his life. It wasn't a new idea he had created, but rather one he had learned about, something that sparked a fire inside him. The idea was called arbitrage. It sounded complicated, but at its core, it was simple. The concept was about buying something in one place for a lower price, then selling it somewhere else for a higher price, making a profit from the difference. It wasn't a new concept. Many people had used it in different forms for years, but Ponzi saw something special in it, something that made his mind race with possibilities. What really caught his attention were the international reply coupons, IRCs. These little coupons were used to pay for postage when sending mail internationally. The value of an IRC was fixed. It could be used to pay for postage anywhere in the world. The trick, Ponzi realized, was that they didn't all cost the same in every country. Depending on where you bought them, the price would vary slightly. In some countries, you could buy them cheaply, and in others, the cost was higher. This gave Ponzi the idea. If he could buy IRCs in one country, where they were cheaper, and sell them in another, where the price was higher, he could make money from the difference. In theory, it sounded perfect. Ponzi could take advantage of the price fluctuations between countries and make a profit. The concept seemed so simple and straightforward, yet no one seemed to be paying attention to it. IRCs were a common tool used by international mailers, but they were not seen as valuable assets. Ponzi saw this gap, this small window of opportunity, and knew it could be the key to his success. He spent countless hours researching the prices of IRCs in different countries. The more he learned, the more certain he became that he had stumbled upon something huge. He realized that with the right amount of money and the right timing, he could buy a large number of IRCs in a country where the prices were lower, then sell them in a country where the prices were higher. It wasn't illegal, but it was definitely taking advantage of a system that many people hadn't even noticed was there. But as Ponzi sat in his prison cell, dreaming of his plan, he knew he couldn't do it alone. He needed a way to get back to the United States, where the market for IRCs was bigger, where he could find the buyers willing to pay more for the coupons. He had no money, but he had a plan. one that was bold, dangerous, and risky. Ponzi needed to get to America, and he needed to do it fast. He couldn't waste any more time. When Ponzi was finally released on parole after 2 long years behind bars, he wasted no time. He was determined to make his dreams a reality, no matter the cost. But he wasn't planning on going back to America alone. Instead, he made a deal. A shady deal that would involve smuggling people into the country. He promised to bring 5 Italian immigrants into the U.S., each of them desperate for a better life. Ponzi didn't care about their papers, he didn't care about the law. All he cared about was getting them across the border, getting to America, and making money off his idea. The plan was simple. He would use the immigrants as his ticket into the country. For each person he brought in, he would make a small fee. Ponzi knew it wasn't going to be easy. Smuggling people across borders was illegal, and there were dangers along the way. But to him, it didn't matter. He was already used to bending the rules, to walking on the edge of what was right and wrong. His only goal was to get back to America and put his idea into action. When the time came, Ponzi gathered the 5 immigrants, each of them eager to start a new life. He led them across borders, making arrangements for them to enter the U.S. illegally. The risks were high, but so were the potential rewards. Once he was back in America, Ponzi knew he could turn his attention to the IRCs, and that's exactly what he did. The rest of the world had no idea that he was plotting, scheming, and setting up his own grand plan for profit. If you've enjoyed this tale so far, make sure to click the subscribe button and stay updated on our next chapters. Trust us, you won't want to miss what happens next in Ponzi's journey, as his ambitions and the world around him continue to twist and turn. Ponzi's journey from prison to America was just the beginning. His plans were much bigger than anyone could imagine, and the world was about to see a man who was willing to do whatever it took to make his fortune. What seemed like a small idea with IRCs was soon going to become one of the most infamous financial schemes in history. It all started with a phone call, the kind that seemed ordinary at first, but quickly turned into something much more. The voice on the other end of the line was calm, persuasive, and filled with an unshakable confidence. "Are you looking to make your money work for you?" the man asked, his tone smooth, almost like he had asked the same question 1,000 times before. John, who had been struggling to make his savings stretch for months, felt a flicker of hope. It was the kind of hope you get when you're at your lowest point and someone offers a way out, even if it sounds too good to be true. "I can guarantee you a 50% return in just 45 days. The voice continued, almost casually. "If you want something bigger, how does 100% return sound in 90 days? John blinked, trying to process what he had just heard. "Wait, did you just say 100% return?" "Exactly," the man said. "And this isn't some risky stock market gamble. This is a secure, well-established operation that's been working for years. You get in, you invest, and watch your money grow. No hassles, no hidden tricks." There was a pause, the silence thick with the weight of the offer. "I know this sounds too good to be true," the man said, sensing the hesitation. "But I've got agents all over the world. They're buying up IRCs in bulk and shipping them to the U.S. It's a streamlined system, everything's in place. Once you're in, you won't regret it." The mention of agents and bulk sounded professional, even if John didn't fully understand what an IRC was. But the man spoke with such conviction, as though he had everything under control. It made John's doubts seem smaller by comparison. "How does it work?" John asked, curiosity winning out over caution. "Well," the man said, lowering his voice slightly, "I can't give you all the details. Some things have to stay confidential, you know? But let's just say I have connections that most people can only dream of. We have exclusive access to these IRCs, which we're able to sell at a significant profit. The system is simple. Buy at bulk prices, sell at retail value, and you make a solid return. I have people everywhere, from Europe to Asia, all making it happen." John had heard of scams before, stories of people being lured in with promises of quick money, only to end up losing everything. But something about the man's voice, his calm assurance, made it hard for him to walk away. "I understand," John said slowly, "but what do I need to do?" "Just trust the system," the man replied, and his voice seemed almost too smooth now. "You invest and I'll take care of the rest. I'll keep you updated and you'll see the results. In fact, I'll even give you a bonus for signing up today. A little incentive to get started." John felt the pit in his stomach twist. It didn't feel right, felt like a trap, but the promise of easy money was so tempting. Maybe it was desperation. Maybe it was just the thrill of being part of something that seemed bigger than himself. Either way, he agreed. A few days later, the money was wired. His savings gone, but the promise of doubling his investment was enough to push away any lingering doubts. Over the next few weeks, he received updates, small reports, photos of shipments, accounts of agents in far-off countries making deals. Everything seemed too polished to be real, but each report made John's confidence grow. The money started to come in, small at first, but it grew steadily. John couldn't believe his luck. It felt like he had stumbled upon the secret to financial success that most people could only dream of. Each time the deposit came through, his doubts grew quieter, drowned out by the excitement of seeing his balance grow. But then, after a few months, things began to slow down. The updates became less frequent. The reports, once detailed and promising, became vague. The market is a little slower than expected, but we're working on it, the man would say whenever John reached out for clarification. John tried to brush it off, convincing himself that every investment had its ups and downs. But as the days turned into weeks, and then into months, the promised returns never quite materialized. Then came the day when he tried to contact the man again and got no response. No phone call, no email, no message. John's heart sank as the realization set in. He had been scammed. The money he had trusted, the promises of fast returns, everything had vanished into thin air. He was left with nothing but the sinking feeling that he had been too naive to see the truth. It wasn't just the money that hurt. It was the betrayal, the manipulation of his hopes and dreams. The man who had promised so much had vanished without a trace, and with him, any chance of recovery. John was left to pick up the pieces, wondering how he had let himself fall for it. And as he looked back, he realized the red flags had been there all along. The secrecy, the promises that were too good to be true, and the simple fact that no one could guarantee such huge returns. But by the time he figured it out, it was too late. And now, all he had was a lesson learned the hard way. If something sounds too good to be true, it probably is. The system Ponzi had used was brilliant in its simplicity. It preyed on people's desperation and greed, offering them the promise of easy money without ever explaining the true cost. And in the end, it wasn't just the investors who lost. It was their trust in anything that promised too much, too quickly. Ponzi walked out of prison after serving 3.5 years. Looking like a man who had been given a second chance. Most people would have seen his release as an opportunity to change, to turn the page and start a new chapter. But Ponzi, he didn't see it that way. The moment he stepped outside the prison gates, there was no hesitation. He didn't have dreams of redemption or paying back his debts to society. No, the old fire was already burning deep inside him, and his mind was whirring with thoughts of the next big hustle. He wasn't interested in playing by the rules. Ponzi was a man who had learned the art of convincing people to believe in things that weren't true, and he was still very much in the game. "I'm a changed man," he might have said, if anyone had bothered to ask. But the truth was, Ponzi had learned nothing. To him, his past mistakes weren't lessons. They were simply obstacles that had momentarily slowed him down. The moment he was out, the familiar, dangerous drive to make quick money flooded back into his veins. Ponzi wasn't a man who learned from failure. He was a man who perfected it. But this time, there were no easy opportunities waiting for him. The government was still watching, aware of his criminal past. He couldn't slip under the radar like he did before. There were no more international scams, no more pretending to have vast networks of agents working on his behalf. The world had changed since he'd gone to prison, and so had the laws. Ponzi, though, was as stubborn as ever. For a brief moment, it seemed like he might have learned the hard way. He tried starting a small business, something legal, perhaps to keep the authorities off his back. But as the weeks passed, his frustration grew. The old instincts tugged at him. He tried small schemes again, no longer as grand as the one that had made him infamous, but still built on deception. The thrill of convincing people to part with their money without giving them anything in return was a rush he couldn't resist. But eventually, it all came crashing down. Ponzi's efforts to rebuild his reputation faltered. The government, tired of his constant schemes, finally put a stop to his activities. They had long since made sure he couldn't run his Ponzi scheme again, and the new scams he tried to pull off were nothing more than desperate attempts to recapture his former glory. In the end, Ponzi was not remembered as a changed man. He was a cautionary tale, a man who, despite everything, never truly learned to let go of the hustle. His story ended in the same way it had started, with him being exposed once again for the fraud he was. He spent the last years of his life in obscurity, living out his days in Italy, far from the headlines he had once dominated. The man who had promised the world could no longer promise anything at all.